It's the middle of March, and as a professional fishing guide, I get lots of questions about fishing for walleyes this time of year, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks as always for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast, brought to us, of course, by Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide, and they will ship direct to a store closest to you. And don't forget about the folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado, ready to take care of all your truck needs. One of my absolute closest friends bought a Tacoma there yesterday. I helped with it, and the whole process took about 4 hours, start to finish. So those guys will get you in and out of there, taking care of outdoorsmen, no sweat. But guys, here we are. Pi Day, March 14th, I believe, is the date today, and middle of March, and that means walleyes. In my neck of the woods, that means walleyes. A lot of people start getting fired up about walleye fishing. It's the time of year to catch big walleyes. There's been already a few of them coming out of my home lake, even though you can't launch a big boat yet, meaning the bank anglers and kayak guys can get to them. And this is really the time of year. If you're a walleye guy, we've done whole podcasts on timing your bite. And if you're a walleye guy, particularly if you're a walleye guy fishing from the bank, really about the next 6 weeks is your best opportunity in most areas of the country to do well with them from the bank, or at least in the western United States where I'm most familiar with them. But, there's some nuances to it, and there's some micro timing over the course of a day and some other things. So since it's one of the most common questions I get year in and year out, I figured we'd talk about it right now. And to be honest with you, the bulk of my walleye fishing occurs around this time of year, typically from about now until, probably the second week of May. And then again, I'll take them up in the midsummer some as well. But for the most part, I target them mostly this time of year and into May. And it's because the access to the biggest ones is most consistent. They're most predictable as far as where they're going to be. And that's always the hardest battle in catching fish, is locating them. So if you kind of have an idea where they're going to be based on a certain, season thing that's going on, well, that's going to help a whole bunch, and that's what really this time of year is all about. And of course, what I'm referencing is the fact that walleyes are going to spawn, and when they're spawning, they're going to do so around wind-blown rock, broken rock of some sort, and they may run up an inlet for that, or up a river of some sort. They may do it on wind-blown dams if there is no inlet to run up. That's what they do here in my home lake. You'll find them on the dams in a lot of cases, or in the corners of the dams. Other lakes that I fish, they'll run the inlet. Places up like Glendo Reservoir in Wyoming, they may go up the river, and other places where there's a full-on river feeding the reservoir. But the thing they're gonna need is either current or wind current, and they're gonna need broken rock, large broken rock. And those two things typically will come together, and that's gonna help you locate where to fish for them. And like I said, that's the biggest part of the battle, is where. The other thing is, they're gonna be within casting length of the bank. So it hasn't been very long since I did the timing podcast about your micro timing of your day, and that was one of the things I talked about. You need to go fishing if you're a bank guy, you need to go when the highest percentage of your fish are going to be within casting range of the bank, and that's for sure going to be the case this time of year for walleyes. The rest of the year they could be anywhere, but right now they're going to be on broken rock somewhere around a bank, and that's going to give you a whole bunch of help. So I thought I'd address a couple of key parts of that. And I don't really have a very complicated approach to doing it for fishing for walleyes this time of year. My approach is very, very simple and very consistent. And I want to throw out there, because people call me out on a somewhat regular basis, I did not come to walleyes till late in life. And I've said that a lot. But the reason I say that is I was really never even exposed to the most traditional walleye angling techniques, particularly as they're practiced back in, say, Minnesota or Wisconsin or something like that. I didn't practice those techniques necessarily or even learn them until I was older. I grew up in South Florida. There's no walleyes down there. I didn't start fishing for them until I was catching them by accident in college when I was bass fishing at my home lake here in Fort Collins. And then I realized, well, wait, if I can catch them by accident, maybe I can catch them on purpose. And they are delicious. We don't want to sugarcoat that. So I learned to fish for them. And then I, of course, had a lot of guide clients that wanted to catch them. So it became a thing for me where I studied them late in life. But because I didn't come to them until I was in my 30s, and I'm in my mid 50s now, or at least in my late 20s, I didn't come to them. I never really learned those techniques, and I developed my own ways to catching them. And what I found out is the way I like to fish for walleyes fits perfect with them around their spawn. So it was one of those serendipitous things that worked out for me. And so my walleye kind of credibility went from there. Now at this point in my life, I've caught quite a few big walleyes. Have done quite a few TV shows on fishing for walleyes with people that are better at walleye fishing than me, and had the opportunity to fish with other guides to target them. Dan Swanson and Austin Parr, Mate Dolinsky, a few others, and that definitely expedites your learning curve. And incidentally, on a side note, if you really want to learn something, pay someone to teach you. So when I wanted to learn lake trout fishing, I went with a lake trout guide. You know, if you want to learn walleye fishing at a high level, go with a walleye guide and bring a list of questions. But at any rate, not to digress too much, but that's what I did, and I've learned them. So let's talk about walleye fishing for the next 6 weeks with as much detail as I can. And also I want to throw out the guys, I had a minor cosmetic procedure, let's just say, the other day where I had to have a mole removed, and unfortunately that mole was on my eyelid, and which is why I had it removed. And so I'm on drugs right now. So if I sound goofy a little bit, that's what it is. But I feel relatively clear-headed, so I just want to throw that out there ahead of time. If I'm talking a little slower than normal, you'll know why. Probably a blessing for most of you because I talk too fast. But at any rate, walleye fishing this time of year, first of all, I've already said it's broken rock thing. No question about that. It's got to be riprap, broken rock, a rocky bank, a river with some riprap on it or broken rock in it, whatever it might be. That's for sure what you're looking for. It needs to have reasonable access to deep water as well. And when I say deep water, I'm talking about water maybe 20 feet or more. It just seems to make them more comfortable. If they can swim 50 yards horizontally and be in 20 feet of water, it seems like they're much better off, or even better if they're 20 or 30 yards out. So that's a key thing, some deep water access. So where you find them is not really the hard part. The one thing I will throw out is it needs to be somewhere where a predominant wind in the spring will blow on that bank. So we're not looking at sheltered banks on a regular basis. And in fact, my favorite banks run north-south on the reservoirs that I fish mostly here in northern Colorado. That's because the valleys orient north-south and the wind tends to be either north-south. So you get a rip current going up or down the bank, one direction or another, more often than not. And that's why my banks tend to be east or west facing banks where the wind will blow from the north or south and go down that bank. So if you've got a round lake in an open valley, maybe that's not the case, but for certain along Front Range where I live, that's going to be a helpful tip as well. So the next thing from there becomes when. When do you target them? And for me, it's the last hour of daylight and into dark. And if you can stomach it, it could be all night long. That has never really fit with my schedule much. I never was permitted to guide during the day when I was, guide at night when I was guiding. I only guided during the day. And so for me, it tended to be fish till an hour after dark and be done with it. And I've done enough trips into the night to realize you're still going to hit lulls even in the middle of the night, just like you will in the daytime. And the most consistent time for me has been the last hour of daylight. So from the timing standpoint, I don't go out and fish for walleyes this time of year all day long. I will typically target something else during the day and then go to wherever it is I expect to find walleyes for the last hour or two of daylight and fish until till at least dark and maybe the first little bit after dark. And I'll also say you probably will hit a lull for the first, say, half hour after dark when I personally attribute it to their eyes adjusting or I don't know, something changes. But then after maybe it's been dark for half an hour or so, then they'll come back around again. You'll get your bite going again. And some of the most consistent fast action I've ever had for walleyes, or all of it, has been within, say, the last half hour of it getting actually dark, when you can barely see the bank, and you just really can do well with it. So that's the timing of it. I don't go in the morning for them, so it's an evening or nighttime thing. So that's pretty easy. I don't have to beat that horse anymore. From there, what are we going to throw, and what nuances are we going to pay attention to? And that's going to be the big difference day in and day out. And for me, the number one thing is going to be, and for a lot of you, I know this one from working at Sportsman's Warehouse for 5 years, is going to be a jerkbait. And here in Colorado, a very high percentage of you are going to throw rogues, super rogues, some sort of a suspending rogue. Smithwick, for whatever reason, has cornered that market pretty well. There's a lot of really good jerkbaits out there, but for whatever reason, that Smithwick Super Rogue tends to be a very good walleye bait. And I think, honestly, it has something to do with the fact that it's actually a little bit of a dumbed down jerkbait. It's an old school jerkbait. It's not quite as erratic as the newer stuff out there, the Megabasses and the Stunnas and all of those. It's also less predictable. The bill on those tends to be a little bit flexible, and they're just a little bit different in how they work, and the walleyes seem to really like them. So it's a jerkbait thing for me a lot of the time. And there's a couple other ones that I definitely throw, particularly in the last few years, and I'm going to get into that here in 1 second. But if I'm in the boat and I'm fishing walleye fishing, I'm going walleye fishing, I'm going to have 2 baits rigged up for sure. And the first one's going to be a rogue of some sort. And I have no affiliation with them. I'm a Berkeley guy through and through, but I'm not going to lie to you. It's very hard to beat a rogue around spawning walleyes. So that's going to be one of them. And then the other one is going to be a swim bait of some sort, a soft swim bait of some sort, like a 3.5 or up to maybe even 5-inch long soft swim bait on a jig head. And the jig head will be relatively light so that I can work that swim bait nice and slow, and it doesn't have to go particularly deep. So it's generally a 1-2 punch for me from the boat, and one of those two will get them caught most of the time. If the wind's really blowing, then I will pick up a lipless crankbait, and for me that's a war pig, could be a rattle trap or a vibe, or there's a whole slew of different ones. But a lipless crankbait like a war pig, it can be really good if it's a really windy day. But if it's not, it's going to be hard to beat the jerkbait and the swim bait combo, one or the other. When it comes to the jerkbait, I'm going to dumb the presentation down a whole bunch, in that I'm going to be doing almost short pulls on the bait rather than a real hard crisp snap like I do for the overwhelming majority of the time. So I'll work the bait way more in almost like a short little, maybe 8 to 10 inch long pulls instead of full snaps. It's still with plenty of slack, still with a full-on pause, stop and go, and a lot of the bites are going to come either when the bait's completely sitting still and you're not doing anything and it's theoretically suspended out there doing what it's doing, or right when you go to pop it. And you'll go to jerk it and there'll be a fish on it instantaneously, and I'm certain that that's because right when the bait moves, they pounce on it. But it's going to be important that you check and make sure your bait does in fact suspend. That's one thing you'll find with rogues. They don't all suspend. You can use something like a Storm Suspend Dot on the bottom of it, golf club tape. There's lots of ways to adjust your jerk bait. Just if you're going to adjust it, make sure you adjust it at the water temperature that you're at, because if you adjust it for 70-degree water and you're synced back home and you're walleye fishing in 45-degree water, it's going to float. And so you have to make sure that the water temperature you're using to adjust your jerk bait is pretty close to the water temperature that you're going to be fishing for walleyes in. So that's one little tip there. The bait needs to be able to suspend. So the general retrieve goes, throw it as close to the bank as you can at an angle to the broken rock or the dam face or whatever it is, and then immediately start pulling the bait with short little pulls and long pauses. Short little pulls, long pauses, or soft pops and long pauses, but not the big aggressive pop that I normally do. That's my number one most effective way to catch them, and I've caught a pile of walleyes doing that in the spring, and I've caught them 2 at a time. I've caught them 2 at a time on film. But typically the males will get very aggressive and jump all over that thing. Now, let's say I've gone down a bank with that jerk bait going both directions, and I mentioned that I want it to cast at angles to the bank. I want the bait to be working at angles to the bank if at all possible, and I want the boat a full cast length off the bank. So I have to make a big long throw, and the reason is anytime I have mature fish in shallow water, they're going to be more spooky about boats, particularly in pressured fisheries. So I want to keep the boat as far away as I can and make a full cast, a full length cast, and that also gives me the most amount of time to work the bait back. And somebody's going to say, well, maybe the boat's in too deep of water for that. And I agree, but you know what? The big females suspend out farther off the bank while the males are up doing a bunch of silly childness stuff up on the bank and getting all aggressive and pouncing on jerkbaits, where the females will a lot of times hang out slightly off the bank in the deeper water and suspend, and they will grab the bait. And the only reason I say that, obviously it's conjecture, I haven't swam with them, but most of the really big ones I've caught at night have been out closer to the boat or in the evening, have been out closer to the boat than right in the bank, whereas my most consistent is in that, say, 2 to 4 feet of water range right off the bank. And those are typically males. Males are quite a bit smaller, and it'll be definitely evident whether it's a boy or not, and I'll spare you the details, but I will tell you that vinegar and water will take that off your boat, and we'll just leave it at that. But the big thing is work the bait all the way back and keep mixing the retrieves up, as we always talk about, steer it different ways, but keep working the bait all the way back to the boat. Once I've gone both directions down a section of bank with that jerk bait, then I'll come through with that soft swim bait, throw it right up on the bank, let it settle, and swim it just fast enough to keep it moving. I kind of want it to follow the bottom contour, but I don't want it to rise per se, but I don't want it to actually on the rocks. So I just try to swim it just fast enough that it will stay just barely off the bottom and keep moving. And that is the other way that I've caught them the most consistently in the evening time from the boat. Now, the key to that swim bait could be the amount of thump that it has. So I'll typically have a variety of soft swim baits in the boat, maybe a power swimmer and a champ swimmer, maybe a hollow belly, maybe a gulp paddle shad, very good choice. Walleyes love gulp. A paddle shad, even more subtle. But each of those different soft swim baits have more or less action depending on which one you choose, and that's why I will mix those up quite a bit. And all other things being equal, if I can have power bait or gulp, I want it. And so particularly gulp when it comes to walleyes. So that paddle shad may get the nod in a lot of scenarios just because it's made out of gulp. So but that's really the only two things I throw from the boat unless the wind's really blowing, and then I'll pick up that lipless crankbait, at which point it's going to be a rip and pause. So the bait will make a bunch of noise, come up in the water column, you kill it, it'll start to settle on tight line, and they'll stroke it. And I really think what a lot of it comes down to is you're just irritating the males. The jerkbait won't leave their space. The lipless crankbait makes all kinds of noise and is fast and erratic and becomes an irritant, and the swim bait is literally hitting them as it swims by, which is why I want it just barely off the bottom. I mean, as close as I can get it without it being in the rocks. So that's kind of my MO there. Now, a lot of you ask me about fishing from the bank, and the only real fundamental difference I'll make is I will not use suspend dots on the bottom of a rogue if I'm going to throw it from the bank. In fact, I almost require a slow float, or you're going to snag and lose a lot of them. And that's a frustration because the bank is coming up to you. Meanwhile, the jerkbait wants to dive, so it's going to basically crash into the bank. And so by using a bait that doesn't suspend well, maybe a slow riser, well, then I can just slack it out a little bit and let it come up and then come to the bank. The other possibility, instead of throwing that rogue, is to throw the hit stick. And that's only been a couple of years for me that I've been throwing that hit stick, I guess 3 now. The Berkley hit stick has been a way overachiever when it comes to catching all kinds of fish. In fact, a couple of the biggest walleyes I've caught in the last couple of years have been on that hit stick. So it's a great bait. It's not as erratic again as some of the other jerk baits out there, and it is a slow riser. So it will work very well from the bank. So anywhere from a number 9 to a number 13 type hit stick would be a great choice. A 9, 11, or 13 would be a good choice. Of course, those are centimeters. So I would definitely consider one of those as well from the bank. The other thing, and I didn't mention this in the boat, but from the bank, I will use a monofilament leader on my braided line. My jerkbaits are always on braided line, and I will use a monofilament leader from the bank. If I'm in the boat, I'll use a fluorocarbon leader, and the reason there is the fluorocarbon leader holds the nose of the bait down better. It'll attain a little bit more depth, which flip side of that, from the bank means it's going to crash into the bank sooner. And so what I want it to do is not do that, so I'll put mono on it from the bank. The other thing is when the jerkbait starts getting close enough to the bank that I'm worried about contact or snagging, I'll start running my rod tip, instead of tip down for my jerks and pauses, it may be tip sideways. And as it gets even closer, now it might even be tip up, depending on how flat the bank really is. And generally I like banks that are 30 to 45 degrees, so steep but not too steep. And so really you can get away with working the rod tip to change up the angle of that bait as it comes to the bank as well. I don't throw the swim bait as much from the bank, but I will throw it as a mop-up deal after I have been already on the bank throwing the jerkbait or whatever. But I'm always going to start with the jerkbait, whether I'm on the bank or I'm in the boat, because it has proven to me over and over and over again in the last 25 years it will get the most bites. So in fact, I'd pick jerkbait for my #1 walleye bait of all time. So that should tell you something. So that's the nuances there. A couple other things. If people night fishing, you have to be very cognizant of how much noise you're making if you're on the bank, particularly because I already mentioned we're on rocky banks. Well, you start rolling rocks around and clanging rocks together because you're moving around, you're going to spook fish. They're in shallow water. They're not comfortable to be in shallow water. You're going to reduce the number of bites you get just by being noisy on the bank. So the first thing is be quiet if you're on the bank, more so than any other way. Same thing as I mentioned with the boat. Keep the boat farther from the bank and make longer throws so your pressure waves aren't right on top of the fish, particularly if they're pressured. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're going to use a light, which I understand you have to use a light at times, keep it out of the water. If there's a light that's on a post and it's there all the time, it can be a benefit to you. If it's a light that's flashing and moving and whatever because it's mounted on your forehead and you're swinging your vision every which way around, it's going to spook fish. It's going to go in the water and spook them. And I know because I've used spotlights for many years to locate walleyes in the spring. Well, if you start flashing that light, as long as you hold it nice and stable, they're okay. But as soon as you start moving it all over the place, they'll lose their mind and they'll flip out and run every which way. So be careful about what you're doing with your light, as far as hitting the water and things like that, because you'll mess them up. Red light or a green light might be better, particularly red light. Might be better for you, and that'll be a particular important thing as well. And then another thing I'll throw out, particularly, well, actually from the boat or the bank, a solid plug retriever, an extendable plug retriever, basically like a golf ball retriever with a ring on the end of it for getting lures back, can be very handy fishing in the dark in the bank or from the boat. So I carry the Fraybill one. It extends to 18 feet. I can reach out and get my jerkbait from the bank or from the boat a lot of the time, and it will save you a bunch of frustration and money. So it's not always convenient to use that thing, and yes, you're going to spook some fish, but when jerkbaits are 10 to 20 bucks a piece, you want them back, and I don't blame you. And so carrying that plug retriever will save you a whole bunch of money, to the point where mine will stay on the deck in the boat all night, the whole time I'm fishing, because I know I'm eventually going to snag that jerkbait on something I couldn't see. It might be a little stick up on the bank, or it's just going to be flat in a rock where the water shallowed out a bit more than I realized and I ran into a crevice. But either way, keeping that plug retriever handy from the bank or the boat will make all the difference in the world. And I've said forever, everyone should have one of those. It amazes me how many people don't. Yeah, they cost 20 to 50 bucks depending on what kind you buy, but that's not very many jerkbaits, and mine gets used probably 100 times a year, literally, when I was guiding. So if it works 75% of the time, and I saved 75 lures, and they were, say, $8 a piece on average, I'm definitely paid for my plug retriever, and mine's like 5 years old. So definitely a worthwhile thing to have. So a little bit of off on a tangent there, but it's a key tip. And for guys fishing at night, and that's also a common question I get, well, how do you work a jerkbait on the bank at night? Don't you snag it a lot? Well, some, But hey, we want to catch fish, and what good is it to go and throw a lure you're not going to snag if you're not going to catch as many fish with it? And so that's my spiel there. So, and then the last thing I'll throw out there, two more quick things. Unless you're going to eat them right now, this is an excellent time to just let them do their thing, because if you let them go, right now, there's going to be a whole bunch of babies coming right behind them. So I'm not saying release all your walleyes. I'm the first guy to say they're delicious and I'll eat some, but don't harvest any more than you need to. And if you do get lucky and stick one of those 10-pound females, consider letting her go and keeping some of those overambitious males that I'm certain you were catching along the same way. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, if this is referenced really to people in my home area right here in Colorado, I live at the lake right here. My house overlooks the lake. I can see it right now out my window. Mountain lions are a thing. And this time of year, they're out and about, and they will be on the lake edges. So pay a little bit of attention. If you're walking around in the dark by yourself, pay a little bit more attention than you might otherwise, because everybody's hungry in early spring. We're just coming out of winter, and everybody's hungry. Mountain lions are pregnant, and they will definitely be looking around as well, which is why Colorado has a lot of lion conflicts this time of year. So pay attention there. I don't generally beat that drum very much, but at the end of the day, I see enough of them that I know it's a thing. So keep that in mind. So appreciate you guys tuning in. If you got questions on walleyes or anything else for that matter, it's chat@fishfulthinker.com. Send me an email. I'll be glad to try to answer them. If you've got ideas for podcasts, love to hear that as well. These things I do them off the cuff, and they're always in response to whatever email questions I get that are current, and that's why I'm throwing that out there. So if you got ideas, let me know. If you want to join the rest of the conversation, that's at Fishful Thinker, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X, and also the YouTube channel. Please subscribe while you are there. So thanks for tuning in. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.